In this chapter, as hitherto, the value of labor power, and therefore the part of the working day necessary for the reproduction or maintenance of that labor power, are supposed to be given constant magnitudes. This premised, with the rate, the mass is at the same time given of the surplus value that the individual laborer furnishes to the capitalist in a definite period of time. If the necessary labor amounts to hours daily, expressed in a quantum of gold equals shillings, then is the daily value of one labor power, or the value of the capital, advanced in the buying of one labor power. If further the rate of surplus value be equals %, this variable capital of produces a mass of surplus value of, or the laborer supplies daily a mass of surplus labor equal to hour. But the variable capital of a capitalist is the expression in money of the total value of all the labor powers that he employs simultaneously. Its value is, therefore, equal to the average value of one labor power, multiplied by the number of labor powers employed. With a given value of labor power, therefore, the magnitude of the variable capital varies directly as the number of laborers employed simultaneously. If the daily value of one labor power equals, then a capital of must be advanced in order to exploit daily labor powers of n times, in order to exploit daily n labor powers. In the same way, if a variable capital of, being the daily value of one labor power, produce a daily surplus value of, a variable capital of, will produce a daily surplus value of, and one of n times, a daily surplus value of n times. The mass of the surplus value produced is therefore equal to the surplus value, which the working day of one laborer supplies multiplied by the number of laborers employed. But as further the mass of surplus value which a single laborer produces, the value of labor power being given, is determined by the rate of the surplus value, this law follows: the mass of the surplus value produced is equal to the amount of the variable capital advanced, multiplied by the rate of surplus value. In other words, it is determined by the compound ratio between the number of labor powers exploited simultaneously by the same capitalist and the degree of exploitation of each individual labor power. Let the mass of the surplus value be S, the surplus value supplied by the individual laborer in the average day, S the variable capital daily advanced in the purchase of one individual labor power V, the sum total of the variable capital V, the value of an average labor power P, its degree of exploitation and the number of laborers employed N. We would have, it is always supposed, not only that the value of an average labor power is constant, but that the laborers employed by a capitalist are reduced to average laborers. There are exceptional cases in which the surplus value produced does not increase in proportion to the number of laborers exploited, but then the value of the labor power does not remain constant. In the production of a definite mass of surplus value, therefore the decrease of one factor may be compensated by the increase of the other. If the variable capital diminishes, and at the same time the rate of surplus value increases in the same ratio, the mass of surplus value produced remains unaltered. If on our earlier assumption the capitalist must advance, in order to exploit laborers a day, and if the rate of surplus value amounts to %, this variable capital yields a surplus value of, or of times working hours. If the rate of surplus value doubles, or the working day, instead of being extended from 2, is extended from to hours, and at the same time variable capital is lessened by half and reduced to, it yields also a surplus value, or times working hours. Diminution of the variable capital may therefore be compensated by a proportionate rise in the degree of exploitation of labor power, or the decrease in the number of the laborers employed by a proportionate extension of the working day. Within certain limits, therefore, the supply of labor exploitable by capital is independent of the supply of labor. On the contrary, a fall in the rate of surplus value leaves unaltered the mass of the surplus value produced, if the amount of the variable capital, or number of the laborers employed, increases in the same proportion. The third law results from the determination of the mass of the surplus value produced by the two factors, rate of surplus value and amount of variable capital advanced. The rate of surplus value, or the degree of exploitation of labor power, and the value of labor power, or the amount of necessary working time being given, it is self-evident that the greater the variable capital, the greater would be the mass of the value produced and of the surplus value. If the limit of the working day is given, and also the limit of its necessary constituent, the mass of value and surplus value that an individual capitalist produces is clearly exclusively dependent on the mass of labor that he sets in motion. But this, under the conditions supposed above, depends on the mass of labor power, or the number of laborers whom he exploits, and this number in its turn is determined by the amount of the variable capital advanced. With a given rate of surplus value, and a given value of labor power, therefore, the masses of surplus value produced vary directly as the amounts of the variable capitals advanced. Now we know that the capitalist divides his capital into two parts. One part he lays out in means of production. This is the constant part of his capital. The other part he lays out in living labor power. This part forms his variable capital. On the basis of the same mode of social production, the division of capital into constant and variable differs in different branches of production, and within the same branch of production, too. This relation changes with changes in the technical conditions and in the social combinations of the processes of production. But in whatever proportion a given capital breaks up into a constant and a variable part, whether the latter is to the former as or x, the law just laid down is not affected by this. For according to our previous analysis, the value of the constant capital reappears in the value of the product, but does not enter into the newly produced value, the newly created value product. To employ spinners, more raw material spindles and are of course required than to employ. The value of these additional means of production, however, may rise, fall, remain unaltered, be large or small. It has no influence on the process of creation of surplus value by means of the labor powers that put them in motion. The law demonstrated above now, therefore, takes this form: the masses of value and of surplus value produced by different capitals, the value of labor power being given, and its degree of exploitation being equal, vary directly as the amounts of the variable constituents of these capitals, as their constituents transformed into living labor power. This law clearly contradicts all experience based on appearance. Everyone knows that a cotton spinner who, reckoning the percentage on the whole of his applied capital, employs much constant and little variable capital, does not, on account of this, pocket less profit or surplus value than a baker, who relatively sets in motion much variable and little constant capital. For the solution of this apparent contradiction, many intermediate terms are as yet wanted. As from the standpoint of elementary algebra, many intermediate terms are wanted to understand that divided by may represent an actual magnitude. Classical economy, although not formulating the law, holds instinctively to it, because it is a necessary consequence of the general law of value. It tries to rescue the law from collision with contradictory phenomena by a violent abstraction. It will be seen later how the school of Ricardo has come to grief over this stumbling block. Vulgar economy, which indeed has really learnt nothing, here as everywhere sticks to appearances in opposition to the law which regulates and explains them. In opposition to Spinoza, it believes that ignorance is a sufficient reason. The labor which is set in motion by the total capital of a society, day in, day out, may be regarded as a single collective working day. If the number of laborers is 1,000,000, and the average working day of a laborer is hours, the social working day consists of 10,000,000 hours. With a given length of this working day, whether its limits are fixed physically or socially, the mass of surplus value can only be increased by increasing the number of laborers, of the laboring population. The growth of population here forms the mathematical limit to the production of surplus value by the total social capital. On the contrary, with a given amount of population, this limit is formed by the possible lengthening of the working day. It will, however, be seen in the following chapter that this law only holds for the form of surplus value dealt with up to the present. From the treatment of the production of surplus value so far, it follows that not every sum of money or of value is at pleasure transformable into capital. To effect this transformation, in fact, a certain minimum of money or of exchange value must be presupposed in the hands of the individual possessor of money or commodity. The minimum of variable capital is the cost price of a single labor power, employed the whole year through, day in, day out, for the production of surplus value. If this laborer were in possession of his own means of production, and were satisfied to live as a laborer, he need not work beyond the time necessary for the reproduction of his means of subsistence, say hours a day. He would, besides, only require the means of production sufficient for working hours. The capitalist, on the other hand, who makes him do, besides these hours, say hours surplus labor, requires an additional sum of money for furnishing the additional means of production. On our supposition, however, he would have to employ 2 laborers in order to live, on the surplus value appropriated daily, as well as, and no better than a laborer, to be able to satisfy his necessary wants. In this case, the mere maintenance of life would be the end of his production, not the increase of wealth, But this latter is implied in capitalist production, that he may live only twice as well as an ordinary laborer, and besides turn half of the surplus value produced into capital, he would have to raise, with the number of laborers, the minimum of the capital advance times. Of course he can, like his laborer, take to work himself, participate directly in the process of production, but he is then only a hybrid between capitalist and laborer, a small master. A certain stage of capitalist production necessitates that the capitalist be able to devote the whole of the time during which he functions as a capitalist, as personified capital, to the appropriation and therefore control of the labor of others, and to the selling of the products of this labor. The guilds of the Middle Ages therefore tried to prevent by force the transformation of the master of a trade into a capitalist, by limiting the number of laborers that could be employed by one master within a very small maximum. The possessor of money or commodities actually turns into a capitalist in such cases only where the minimum sum advanced for production greatly exceeds the maximum of the Middle Ages. Here, as in natural science, is shown the correctness of the law discovered by Hegel, that merely quantitative differences beyond a certain point pass into qualitative changes. The minimum of the sum of value that the individual possessor of money or commodities must command, in order to metamorphose himself into a capitalist, changes with the different stages of development of capitalist production, and is at given stages different in different spheres of production, according to their special and technical condition. Certain spheres of production demand, even at the very outset of capitalist production, a minimum of capital that is not as yet found in the hands of single individuals. This gives rise partly to state subsidies to private persons, as in France in the time of Clauber, and as in many German states up to our own epoch, partly to the formation of societies with legal monopoly for the exploitation of certain branches of industry and commerce, the forerunners of our modern joint stock company. Within the process of production, as we have seen, capital acquired the command over labor, over functioning labor power or the laborer himself. Personified capital, the capitalist takes care that the laborer does his work regularly and with the proper degree of intensity. Capital further developed into a coercive relation, which compels the working class to do more work than the narrow round of its own life wants prescribes. As a producer of the activity of others, as a pumper out of surplus labor and exploiter of labor power, it surpasses in energy, disregard of bounds, recklessness, and efficiency all earlier systems of production based on directly compulsory labor. At first, capital subordinates labor on the basis of the technical conditions in which it historically finds it. It does not, therefore, change immediately the mode of production. The production of surplus value, in the form hitherto considered by us, by means of simple extension of the working day, proved, therefore, to be independent of any change in the mode of production itself. It was not less active in the old-fashioned bakeries than in the modern cotton factories. If we consider the process of production from the point of view of the simple labor process, the laborer stands in relation to the means of production, not in their quality as capital, but as the mere means and material of his own intelligent productive activity. In tanning, he deals with the skins as his simple object of labor. It is not the capitalist whose skin he tans. But it is different as soon as we deal with the process of production, from the point of view of the process of creation of surplus value. The means of production are at once changed into means for the absorption of the labor of others. It is now no longer the laborer that employs the means of production, but the means of production that employ the laborer. Instead of being consumed by him as material elements of his productive activity, they consume him as the ferment necessary to their own life process, and the life process of capital consists only in its movement as value constantly expanding, constantly multiplying itself. Furnaces and workshops that stand idle by night and absorb no living labor are to the capitalist. Hence, furnaces and workshops constitute lawful claims upon the night labor of the workpeople. The simple transformation of money into the material factors of the process of production, into means of production, transforms the latter into a title and a right to the labor and surplus labor of others. An example will show in conclusion how this sophistication, peculiar to and characteristic of capitalist production, this complete inversion of the relation between dead and living labor, between value and the force that creates value, mirrors itself in the consciousness of capitalists. During the revolt of the English factory lords between, and this then wrote a letter in the Glasgow Daily Mail of April H, with the title, in which among other things the following grotesquely naive passage occurs: "Worked hours before, and is limited to, then every machines or spindles in his establishment shrink to, and should the works be disposed of, they will be valued only as, so that a sixth part would thus be deducted from the value of every factory in the country. This west of Scotland bourgeois brain, inheriting the accumulated capitalistic qualities of 4 generations, the value of the means of production, spindles, and is so inseparably mixed up with their property as capital to expand their own value, and to swallow up daily a definite quantity of the unpaid labor of others, that the head of the firm of Karl and Co. actually imagines that if he sells his factory, not only will the value of the spindles be paid to him. In addition, their power of annexing surplus value, not only the labor which is embodied in them, and is necessary to the production of spindles of this kind, but also the surplus labor which they help to pump out daily from the brave Scots of Paisley, and for that very reason he thinks that, with the shortening of the working day by hours, the selling price of spinning machines dwindles to that portion of the working day which merely produces an equivalent for the value paid by the capitalist for his labor power, has, up to this point, been treated by us as a constant magnitude, and such in fact it is, under given conditions of production, and at a given stage in the economic development of society. Beyond this, his necessary labor time, the laborer we saw, could continue to work for and hours. The rate of surplus value and the length of the working day depended on the magnitude of this prolongation. Though the necessary labor time was constant, we saw, on the other hand, that the total working day was variable. Now suppose we have a working day whose length, and whose apportionment between necessary labor and surplus labor, are given. Let the whole line a B, C represent, for example, a working day of hours, the portion of a B hours of necessary labor, and the portion B C hours of surplus labor. How now can the production of surplus value be increased? How can the surplus labor be prolonged without, or independently of, any prolongation of a C? Although the length of a C is given, BC appears to be capable of prolongation, if not by extension beyond its end C, which is also the end of the working day a C. Yet, at all events, by pushing back its starting point B in the direction of assume that BB in the line AB is equal to half of BC or to 1 hour's labor time. If now in a C, the working day of hours, we move the point B to B, BC becomes BC. The surplus labor increases by 1/2 from hours to hours, although the working day remains as before at hours. This extension of the surplus labor time from BC to BC, from hours to hours, is, however, evidently impossible without a simultaneous contraction of the necessary labor time from a B into a B, from hours to hour. The prolongation of the surplus labor would correspond to a shortening of the necessary labor, or a portion of the labor time previously consumed, in reality, for the laborer's own benefit, would be converted into labor time for the benefit of the capitalist. There would be an alteration, not in the length of the working day, but in its division into necessary labor time and surplus labor time. On the other hand, it is evident that the duration of the surplus labor is given, when the length of the working day and the value of labor power are given. The value of labor power, the labor time requisite to produce labor power, determines the labor time necessary for the reproduction of that value. If 1 working hour be embodied in 6pence, and the value of a day's labor power be 5 shillings, the laborer must work hours a day, in order to replace the value paid by capital for his labor power, or to produce an equivalent for the value of his daily necessary means of subsistence. Given the value of these means of subsistence, the value of his labor power is given, and given the value of his labor power, the duration of his necessary labor time is given. The duration of the surplus labor, however, is arrived at by subtracting the necessary labor time from the total working day. 10 hours subtracted from 12 leave 2, and it is not easy to see how, under the given conditions, the surplus labor can possibly be prolonged beyond 2 hours. No doubt the capitalist can, instead of 5 shillings, pay the laborer 4 shillings and 6pence or even less. For the reproduction of this value of 4 shillings and 6pence, 9 hours labor time would suffice, and consequently 3 hours of surplus labor, instead of 2, would accrue to the capitalist, and the surplus value would rise from 1 shilling to 18pence. This result, however, would be obtained only by lowering the wages of the laborer below the value of his labor power. With the 4 shillings and 6pence which he produces in 9 hours, he commands 1/10 less of the necessaries of life than before, and consequently the proper reproduction of his labor power is crippled. The surplus labor would in this case be prolonged only by an overstepping of its normal limits. Its domain would be extended only by a usurpation of part of the domain of necessary labor time. Despite the important part which this method plays in actual practice, we are excluded from considering it in this place, by our assumption that all commodities, including labor power, are bought and sold at their full value. Granted this, it follows that the labor time necessary for the production of labor power, or for the reproduction of its value, cannot be lessened by a fall in the laborer's wages below the value of his labor power, but only by a fall in this value itself. Given the length of the working day, the prolongation of the surplus labor must of necessity originate in the curtailment of the necessary labor time. The latter cannot arise from the former. In the example we have taken, it is necessary that the value of labor power should actually fall by 1/10, in order that the necessary labor time may be diminished by 1/10, from 10 hours to 9, and in order that the surplus labor may consequently be prolonged from 2 hours to 3. Such a fall in the value of labor power implies, however, that the same necessaries of life which were formerly produced in 10 hours can now be produced in 9 hours. But this is impossible without an increase in the productiveness of labor. For example, suppose a shoemaker, with given tools, makes in one working day of 12 hours, 1 pair of boots. If he must make 2 pairs in the same time, the productiveness of his labor must be doubled, and this cannot be done except by an alteration in his tools or in his mode of working, or in both. Hence the conditions of production, his mode of production, and the labor process itself must be revolutionized. By increase in the productiveness of labor, we mean, generally, an alteration in the labor process, of such a kind as to shorten the labor time socially necessary for the production of a commodity, and to endow a given quantity of labor with the power of producing a greater quantity of use value. Hitherto, in treating of surplus value, arising from a simple prolongation of the working day, we have assumed the mode of production to be given and invariable. But when surplus value has to be produced by the conversion of necessary labor into surplus labor, it by no means suffices for capital to take over the labor process in the form under which it has been historically handed down, and then simply to prolong the duration of that process. The technical and social conditions of the process, and consequently the very mode of production, must be revolutionized before the productiveness of labor can be increased. By that means alone can the value of labor power be made to sink, and the portion of the working day necessary for the reproduction of that value be shortened. The surplus value produced by prolongation of the working day I call absolute surplus value. On the other hand, the surplus value arising from the curtailment of the necessary labor time, and from the corresponding alteration in the respective lengths of the two components of the working day, I call relative surplus value. In order to effect a fall in the value of labor power, the increase in the productiveness of labor must seize upon those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power, and consequently either belong to the class of customary means of subsistence, or are capable of supplying the place of those means. But the value of a commodity is determined, not only by the quantity of labor which the laborer directly bestows upon that commodity, but also by the labor contained in the means of production. For instance, the value of a pair of boots depends not only on the cobbler's labor, but also on the value of the leather, wax, thread, and hence, a fall in the value of labor power is also brought about by an increase in the productiveness of labor, and by a corresponding cheapening of commodities in those industries which supply the instruments of labor and the raw material, that form the material elements of the constant capital required for producing the necessaries of life. But an increase in the productiveness of labor in those branches of industry which supply neither the necessaries of life, nor the means of production for such necessaries, leaves the value of labor power undisturbed. The cheapened commodity, of course, causes only a pro tanto fall in the value of labor power, a fall proportional to the extent of that commodity's employment in the reproduction of labor power. Shirts, for instance, are a necessary means of subsistence, but are only one out of many. The totality of the necessaries of life consists, however, of various commodities, each the product of a distinct industry, and the value of each of those commodities enters as a component part into the value of labor power. This latter value decreases with the decrease of the labor time necessary for its reproduction, the total decrease being the sum of all the different curtailments of labor time affected in those various and distinct industries. This general result is treated here as if it were the immediate result directly aimed at in each individual case. Whenever an individual capitalist cheapens shirts, for instance, by increasing the productiveness of labor, he by no means necessarily aims at reducing the value of labor power and shortening, pro tanto, the necessary labor time. But it is only in so far as he ultimately contributes to this result that he assists in raising the general rate of surplus value. The general and necessary tendencies of capital must be distinguished from their forms of manifestation. It is not our intention to consider, here, the way in which the laws immanent in capitalist production manifest themselves in the movements of individual masses of capital, where they assert themselves as coercive laws of competition, and are brought home to the mind and consciousness of the individual capitalist as the directing motives of his operation. But this much is clear: a scientific analysis of competition is not possible before we have a conception of the inner nature of capital, just as the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are not intelligible to any but him who is acquainted with their real motions, motions which are not directly perceptible by the senses. Nevertheless, for the better comprehension of the production of relative surplus value, we may add the following remarks, in which we assume nothing more than the results we have already obtained. Nevertheless, even in this case, the increased production of surplus value arises from the curtailment of the necessary labor time, and from the corresponding prolongation of the surplus labor. Let the necessary labor time amount to hours, the value of a day's labor power to 5 shillings, the surplus labor time to hours, and the daily surplus value to 1 shilling. But the capitalist now produces articles, which he sells at 10p apiece, making 20 shillings in all. Since the value of the means of production is 12 shillings, divided by of these articles merely replace the constant capital advanced. The labor of the hour's working day is represented by the remaining divided by articles. Since the price of the labor power is 5 shillings, articles represent the necessary labor time, and divided by articles the surplus labor. The ratio of the necessary labor to the surplus labor, which under average social conditions is now only. The same result may be arrived at in the following way. The value of the product of the working day of hours is 20 shillings. Of this sum, 12 shillings belong to the value of the means of production, a value that merely reappears. There remain 8 shillings, which are the expression in money of the value newly created during the working day. This sum is greater than the sum in which average social labor of the same kind is expressed. 12 hours of the latter labor are expressed by 6 shillings only. The exceptionally productive labor operates as intensified labor. It creates in equal periods of time greater values than average social labor of the same kind. But our capitalist still continues to pay as before only 5 shillings as the value of a day's labor power. Hence, instead of hours, the laborer need now work only a half hours in order to reproduce this value. His surplus labor is, therefore, increased by a half hours, and the surplus value he produces grows from 1 into 3 shillings. Hence, the capitalist who applies the improved method of production appropriates to surplus labor a greater portion of the working day than the other capitalists in the same trade. He does individually what the whole body of capitalists engaged in producing relative surplus value do collectively. On the other hand, however, this extra surplus value vanishes so soon as the new method of production has become general and has consequently caused the difference between the individual value of the cheapened commodity and its social value to vanish. The law of the determination of value by labor time, a law which brings under its sway the individual capitalist who applies the new method of production, by compelling him to sell his goods under their social value. This same law, acting as a coercive law of competition, forces his competitors to adopt the new method. The general rate of surplus value is, therefore, ultimately affected by the whole process, only when the increase in the productiveness of labor has seized upon those branches of production that are connected with, and has cheapened those commodities that form part of, the necessary means of subsistence, and are therefore elements of the value of labor power. The value of commodities is in inverse ratio to the productiveness of labor. And so, too, is the value of labor power, because it depends on the values of commodities. Relative surplus value is, on the contrary, directly proportional to that productiveness. It rises with rising and falls with falling productiveness. The value of money being assumed to be constant, an average social working day of hours always produces the same new value, 6 shillings, no matter how this sum may be apportioned between surplus value and wages. But if, in consequence of increased productiveness, the value of the necessaries of life fall, and the value of a day's labor power be thereby reduced from 5 shillings to 3, the surplus value increases from 1 shilling to 3. 10 hours were necessary for the reproduction of the value of the labor power. Now only 6 are required. 4 hours have been set free and can be annexed to the domain of surplus labor. Hence there is immanent in capital an inclination and constant tendency to heighten the productiveness of labor in order to cheapen commodities, and by such cheapening to cheapen the laborer himself. The value of a commodity is in itself of no interest to the capitalist. What alone interests him is the surplus value that dwells in it and is realizable by sale. Realization of the surplus value necessarily carries with it the refunding of the value that was advanced. Now, since relative surplus value increases in direct proportion to the development of the productiveness of labor, while on the other hand, the value of commodities diminishes in the same proportion, since one and the same process cheapens commodities and augments the surplus value contained in them, we have here the solution of the riddle. Why does the capitalist, whose sole concern is the production of exchange value, continually strive to depress the exchange value of commodities? A riddle with which Quesnay, one of the founders of political economy, tormented his opponents, and to which they could give him no answer. You acknowledge, he says, that the more expenses and the cost of labor can, in the manufacture of industrial products, be reduced without injury to production, the more advantageous is such reduction, because it diminishes the price of the finished article. And yet, you believe that the production of wealth, which arises from the labor of the workpeople, consists in the augmentation of the exchange value of their products. The shortening of the working day is, therefore, by no means what is aimed at in capitalist production, when labor is economized by increasing its productiveness. It is only the shortening of the labor time, necessary for the production of a definite quantity of commodities, that is aimed at. The fact that the workman, when the productiveness of his labor has been increased, produces, say, times as many commodities as before, and thus spends 1/10 as much labor time on each, by no means prevents him from continuing to work hours as before, nor from producing in those hours articles instead of. Nay more, his working day may be prolonged at the same time, so as to make him produce, say, articles in hours. In the treatises, therefore, of economists of the stamp of Mac Culloch, Ure, Senior, and Tutti Quanti, we may read upon one page that the laborer owes a debt of gratitude to capital for developing his productiveness, because the necessary labor time is thereby shortened, and on the next page that he must prove his gratitude by working in future for hours instead of. The object of all development of the productiveness of labor within the limits of capitalist production is to shorten that part of the working day, during which the workman must labor for his own benefit, and by that very shortening to lengthen the other part of the day, during which he is at liberty to work gratis for the capitalist. How far this result is also attainable without cheapening commodities will appear from an examination of the particular modes of producing relative surplus value, to which examination we now proceed.